Hello and welcome to another episode of Start Writing. Today we have as a guest with us Raymond O'Connor. And Ray is a software dev by day and a Dungeons and Dragons master by night. And he has published two works related to Dungeons and Dragons, which you can find on the Dungeon Masters Guild. And he's also hosting a podcast called Running Off the Rails. And we wanted to chat with him today because of his expertise in world building. So Ray, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I do want to throw in one more thing, because when I first got the email for the interview for Ray, which we get a lot of these, Jay is just now learning as I'm starting to forward them to him now that he's in charge of production. We get a lot of emails from various authors wanting to be interviewed on the show. And I did just forward it to Jay because he's in charge of production, but I really hoped he would pick you. And the reason was this. In your email to us talking about it, you mentioned that a lot of people want to world build, that is very fun for them, exciting and interesting. But then to sit down and write a novel involves doing a lot of things either they don't know how to, and maybe not even be interested in learning how to do, right? The structuring your plot, setting up cliffhangers, developing your characters, creating character arcs, that might not be things you're interested in doing. And so there is a way to pursue writing where you don't have to do those things. And that is where you said, for you, that was Dungeons and Dragons, but there's a whole group of tabletop genres in different ways that allow that. You can go in, you can do your world building, you can do the kind of writing you love without having to do all the pieces you don't love. And I was like, that is something I want to talk about, because I think there's definitely a group of listeners who need to hear that, because they're like, I freaking hate sitting down and working on my plot. I have even worked with authors who they've written this 500-page novel, and they have spent pages and pages and pages describing and talking about their world. And there's barely any plot. There's barely any character. And they hate all that criticism because they know that's where they struggle, because they don't want to do that. And, having met those people and read your emails, like, this is for them. This is where they need to be writing, not that novel. They need to be doing their world building here, because here they can do the thing they love in the way they love, because you can go into incredible detail in these manuals, because this is a manual about how it works. That's what you're writing, And so while a reader group would say, this is 4 pages of dull exposition, the manual for whatever you've written, they're like, I want more.
So Ray, tell us the story. Was there a moment where you realized you didn't have to be a novelist, but you could still do what you loved? Is there a story behind all that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up doing plays and musicals, and I grew up watching anime and Pokemon and like everything, movies. And I remember I would just pace my room, like thinking of these worlds that existed in my imagination clearly. And then I was a kid, so I'll use that as my excuse, but I would sit down to write, and I would maybe get through 20 pages, 100 if maybe that was the biggest or the farthest I ever got. And first of all, I was bad at it, because I was a kid. Even in high school or in college, though, I was still bad at it. And I didn't really have the time to invest in pursuing mastery in the craft of writing, which is certainly worth pursuing as a craft. But I'm pursuing software development and other things, and I just don't have that time. And then I discovered Dungeons and Dragons, where someone asked me to make a character. So I picked one of the characters that...
Can I ask, how old were you at this point?
At this point, I was in college. This is my senior year of college. So I was like 21 at this point. And they asked me to make a character. So I made this paladin where he had a mentor that had been slain by his evil brother who stole his mentor's sword, and he didn't know why. He didn't know why he did it. Like, he had been his half brother his entire life. They had been best friends. And then that was the character that I was showing up to the table with. And I didn't even have to write it down. It was all in my head. I maybe had to send it to my dungeon master, so that way they kind of had an idea of what I was trying to accomplish at the table as we played Dungeons and Dragons. But for the first time ever, I got to share a story with a group of 4 other people around the table. And the reason why that works is because those people who are sitting around the table with you are there. It's reciprocal. They're sharing their stories with you as you share your story with them and discover your story at the table. And that's the magic of Dungeons and Dragons, is you get to write without really having to spend much preparation at all. And at first that was just a way to kind of get that fulfillment, because my entire life, all these stories had just been bottled up in my head and I could never get them. Forget about getting them on paper. I'll never get them in front of another person. And then if they're reading it, they won't see it the way that I see it, because I'm not a skilled enough writer to deliver that description to them such that they see it the way I see it in my imagination. But at the Dungeons and Dragons table, you get to experience that with a bunch of other people. So, and I got to engage in acting, which was something I loved in high school. I was a lead in like all my high school musicals, and I had to give it up because acting is such a time commitment, hours and hours every day to be in musicals or plays. And so I got to engage in that again as well. So it's just amazing. It's my passion.
Okay,
That's
so
so cool.
then talk to me about where you transitioned to writing your own material, because now you're writing and you're preparing a Kickstarter campaign. And so is it a module? Is it an extension? Because I know one of the books that I picked up, it was like about the diseases and some changes and adjustments to them that I really enjoyed, because the diseases are silly, but cure disease and you're good to go, right? And you just move on. And so this was a change to those, which I was really, so what exactly is it you have written, and then how did you transition into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I really wanted to contribute something mechanical to the community. So I didn't want to just be consuming material anymore. I really wanted to take my shot at contributing content to this community that then other people could use to fulfill their fantasies at their tables. And something that I had always felt was missing from Dungeons and Dragons was the fantasy of, this was the first product I made, which was Pact of the Dragon God. And in Dungeons and Dragons, you can have warlocks, which is this concept of an individual who gets magic from a higher power that gifts it to them in exchange for something. So this would be very similar to Lethos in Star Child. Yes, exactly. Dre is very much a warlock, or at least from what I understand from Exile.
Totally.
But there wasn't an opportunity to choose Tiamat as your patron, or like a compelling draconic patron that would then give you dragon-like abilities, like a dragon wizard. So that's how my first product came alive. Was my player wanted to do that. They wanted to do it at the table, so I needed to make it anyway. And I had grown enough with the hobby where it had been my passion for many years at this point that I felt comfortable with the balancing of other material that exists out there in the world, and I made my own. And I know of a few people now who give me feedback because they're using the class and they love it. So it's amazing. And I make changes and revisions based on their feedback as well.
Okay. So you wrote this class, and that allowed you to engage in, I guess, a lot of world building and contribute back to the community. And now you're working on something bigger that you'll be pitching to Kickstarter, which is moving you from not just writing, but writing in an attempt to make a profit.
Not even still, actually. So the only reason there'll be a price on the Kickstarter is because we want to communicate the value, because we really do believe that our product is valuable. So is
this still top secret, or what are you working on?
So I guess it can. We'll debut it on your show. We're working on a Kickstarter for something that we're calling legendary eminences. In Dungeons and Dragons, there's this concept of a legendary resistance. So if you have a monster that is powerful enough, you basically have a mechanic that exists in the game that allows them to opt out of debilitating effects 3 times. So say you have this all-powerful dragon that you've been building up as the campaign ending boss for this adventure that you and your friends have been going on for the last 3 years. There are spells that wizards have at their disposal that let them turn monsters into cute little fluffy bunnies. They can cause monsters to hallucinate or do all different types of things.
Strip their levels.
Yep, exactly. So legendary resistances allow those monsters to basically have like a few protections against those. But my feeling is that that's very unfun. So if you're the wizard and you use your very powerful spell and it would have succeeded, but then the monster just chooses to succeed because it has a legendary resistance, that's not very satisfactory for the player who has expended one of their very valuable resources to try and damage this monster in a significant way. So we've introduced a concept called legendary eminences, which are passive abilities that are up while the monster has their legendary resistances. So we acknowledge that legendary resistances basically have to exist in the game, so that way your wizard doesn't nullify this super climactic battle that you've been building up to. But we want there to be an effect there. So like an ancient fire dragon might have a very powerful and hot, like flaming aura around them that makes it such that that it causes like fire damage to the people around them and causes them to suffocate as they like breathe in sulfuric fumes. As you strip that monster of its legendary resistances, that aura will decrease in strength. So you
still get something out of it. It's not just a wash.
Exactly. And so I think the example for the Archmage that we've added is they can concentrate on 2 spells instead of 1 spell while they still have their legendary resistance. And Archmages don't traditionally have legendary resistances. So I've actually given some legendary resistances to monsters that we think could use 1 or 2 of them. And we're really excited about it. We think it's gonna.
Sounds like a good mechanic. Yeah.
And that's kind of that's the way I like to interact with Dungeons and Dragons from a writing perspective, from a writing perspective, is I try to find things that don't feel quite right, or feel like they could be a little bit better, or feel like they're missing. And that's where I like to add to the hobby.
Man, I just have to say, I don't know much about D&D, but I always had these lingering doubts about how things would work and whether they would work well. And it seems like you're the answer to that doubt. It's like you can fix any sort of problem that these might have if you think through it well. Anyway, that's so cool.
Yeah. Well, not that, but I really hope that the world builders just got excited, because think about it. He's like, there is a mechanic that I want to think about in my world building, and I can write a bunch on it, and then I can sell that product, right? That is what so many of them want to do. Just write about the mechanics of their world, right? This is how my magic works. You sit down and you write it, and that's it. You don't have to write the characters. You don't have to write the plot, just the mechanics. This is my world. This is how it works.
And for most dungeon masters, you actually don't even have to write it. So creating a product like the one that we're going to release on Kickstarter requires tons and tons of hours because you're not just writing the fiction, which you are writing the fiction for it. You're also making sure that mechanically it's balanced and won't break what is already a very like precarious ecosystem of rules.
Yes. I was actually wondering that as I was reading through your, was it the Weave?
The Weave Breaker.
The Weave Breaker. Yeah. I was like, how did he balance test this?
Yeah, so the real trick, and lots of people are going to get mad at me for saying this, is Dungeons and Dragons is already pretty unbalanced.
True.
So when people obsess about the balance of things, I think they're grabbing onto something that they can point at and yell about. So balance testing, I do play test the things that I write, but even published material, which is play tested, is unbalanced. So for anyone out there who for anyone out there who's a listener of yours who's been writing Dungeons and Dragons material and has refrained from publishing because you're afraid that it's not balanced or you don't have play testing, don't let that be the thing that stops you. Get it out there. If it's broken, people will let you know, and then you can fix it.
So what is it? I don't know if you're familiar with, but there's a Dungeons and Dragons Online, and the very early editions of it was just straight up D&D converted to a digital format. And very quickly they started have to changing things, because when you play D&D at a tabletop, you've got four to six people playing a game, and the combat can take an hour, to get through a single fight. In the digital version, you could do a fight in like 10 seconds, right? And then you've got millions of people moving through fights that fast. And so very quickly, the unbalanced features of the game rise to the top because people start doing weird things that work really well. Like there was a point in the game where everybody just carried around a wand of smite evil, because any evil creature you would like instantly stun and blind, and they had no saves. And they're like, this is a weak spell. And they're doing these to very powerful monsters, and it's just breaking the game because it was unbalanced when it was written. And so very quickly they had to start changing things, because the learning curve of what you could exploit once the game was accelerated to that pace was very fast. So very quickly things started changing very quickly, because there were a ton of things that were just never balanced, and nobody knew because you were playing with 5 or 6 people, and it took you an hour to do now what you do in 10 seconds.
And I think that's a feature, not a bug. And what I mean by that is, if, especially for your audience, if you go into Dungeons and Dragons worrying about the mechanic, like winning the game, then you're going at it all wrong. Like focus on the mechanics and the rules acting as a framework from which to kind of like guide your creativity. So what I mean by that is, if you're playing a game of kind of like telephone storytelling, where each person just goes around in a circle and says what happens next in the story, and there's no rules and there's no restrictions, it doesn't feel as fun to me, because Jim can just decide that the main character kills the dragon by stabbing it in the eyeball. And then the next person doesn't get to say what happened in the dragon fight, because the dragon fight's over because Jim decided. Whereas with Dungeons and Dragons, the rules exist as a way to foster creativity through restrictions. So you get to say, I'm going to attack the dragon, but then the rules help decide whether or not that attack hits, or how much damage it does. And that helps for the story to kind of unfold at the table rather than somebody telling the story. Everyone's kind of discovering the story together, because the dice add that level of randomness to the story.
Yeah. So I just got to ask, as an outsider, I think if I were to play D&D, I would have the urge to somehow preserve this really cool thing that we created. And I mean, you're saying sometimes over the period of years. Do you ever wish you could archive it? And if so, how would you do that?
So lots of people do archive their stuff. So there are plenty of people who stream their games of Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah. So much so that market is actually quite saturated. If you were to be like, hey, we're gonna videotape our game of Dungeons and Dragons, no one's ever gonna see it because there's already hundreds of those out there. But I mean, recording the audio of your games, if you're worried about losing those memories, that's a great way to keep those memories. Even just our podcast, where we talk at the meta level about how you can introduce specific elements to your game to make a more deliberate experience at your table. That has been an amazing archive of like synthesized thoughts that me and Ariel have come up with. And like, if I'm struggling to come up with something for the session for the day of Dungeons and Dragons, I've gone back and I've listened to some of the episodes that we've done on that material, and I've been like, oh yeah, we already figured this out, and this is the conclusion we came to, and then I'll use that content.
So
Cool.
well, and is it? So we did talk about Margaret Rice and Tracy Hickman. You know, they started out playing D&D, and then they went on to write the Dragonlance books. But is it Michael Scott Earl is an author? He writes a lot of fantasy novels as well. And while he writes fantasy, he grew up playing Shadowrun. And he's even said, he says, sometimes I would just take a campaign of Shadowrun we did and reskin it in fantasy, and that's the story.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things you come up with feel very special. So I'm also a player in a campaign. We're running Tomb of Annihilation right now, and I just had the most. I peaked. I think it was 3 weeks ago. I'll never have another character experience that was as magical as this one at the table, where the story that unfolded for my paladin, I couldn't. It was breathtaking. I was like almost in tears as it was as the confrontation occurred. He was confronting someone who was kind of his foil, which was very difficult for him to do. Someone who had taken the same oaths as him, but had defied those oaths. And in that enemy who the dungeon master had created, which was amazing that I gave him my backstory and he created this conflict that would externalize the backstory that I had passed to him. Like we were real time arguing about the ideals of our characters, and the other players at the table were like just looking back and forth, and they're like, what's going to happen? Are these guys going to fight? Are they going to hug? Like what's going to happen? We ended up having to kill him. And that was really brutal. And then my character, the hammer, the magic hammer that of our shared god, deemed my character worthy to wield it despite the conflict that had just occurred. So that was like a really cool feeling as well. Yeah.
That's super cool.
Yeah. If this sounds fun, if you're listening and this sounds fun, play Dungeons and Dragons because it's amazing. Yeah, because I mean, writing is so hard. Writing is so hard. I'm so bad at it. But I've already been able to share entire books worth of plot with my friends, both as a player and a dungeon master. And I cherish those experiences because I just felt all these stories bottled up inside me, screaming to get out. And I would have never been able to share those stories as books. And then forget about writing the book, getting anyone to read it. Forget about it. It's impossible.
And I just got to say the collaborative experience where you're sharing this creation. I'm an introvert and I'm okay spending a lot of hours writing, but there are still times where it's like, man, I just want to connect, and I connect with readers after the fact, but that's years later after sitting in isolation. And that's really cool that with D&D, you're the four of you or six of you are making this story together live. That just sounds awesome.
That's because it is awesome.
Oh, that's excellent. Okay, this is an existential question. I'm not sure I could even answer it, but you talked about this. You have this drive to create. Like where is that coming from? Why do you have to make these stories, and why is D&D then the outlet for that? Like,
well, and why did you go into programming with all this creativity?
Those are great questions. I'm gonna have an existential crisis on your show. I don't know if there's a reason why. It just feels like it's a part of me. It's been a part of me for as long as I can remember. Watching Pokemon when I was a kid, and seeing Ash, and immediately the episode would end and I would go into my room and I would pace, or I'd sit, or I'd jump on the trampoline. And I would imagine me as a Pokemon trainer and like the Pokemon that I would have in the show, and the types of conflicts that we would run into, like that. It's been a part of me for as long as I can remember. And then the drive to create my own worlds, not just stories in existing worlds, that I think that developed with the Fire Emblem games. So when I was a kid, I encountered these games on the Game Boy Advance called the Fire Emblem series, and I think that was like, I want to create a country that had, or a continent that has different countries and with different forms of government, and this is the type of story that would play out in this. Yeah. So why? I don't know. It's a part of me, and it will always be a part of me. And I'm so thankful that I found a medium through which to let it out, and people who will share that experience with me. And then why did I become a computer programmer? Because I got to pay the bills. No, I don't know. I was in high school, and I had good grades in my English classes, but also my math classes, and I love video games. So I applied to schools for kind of the mixture of the two, which was video game design for me. It's like the creative side and the math side. And then I got to school, and at orientation, they had a dual degree in business. And I knew that game devs were just super, super not paid comparatively well to just kind of run-of-the-mill software engineers. And I also knew that it was very demanding. The pursuit of mastery in that craft requires hours, very similar to architecture. Just so much work, especially in college. And I just made a game time choice to switch to business and computer science instead of game design.
Okay.
And then, I don't know, doors open and close. And now here I am, some decisions just happen to you. You don't necessarily make them.
Do you have a favorite D&D video game?
Ooh, no. I actually think the D&D video games are actually pretty bad. They're almost unanimously really bad. But
have you tapped into the beta for Baldur's Gate 3?
So I've heard that Baldur's Gate 3 is pretty good. I'm going to play it when it's finally released.
Yeah, see, I loved the Divinity series that they built first as their kind of audition. I thought those, I don't even think I found all the different ways you could accomplish a quest. Like, there were some times I'd just be like, start a new character and just like stumble around and be like, where's this go? Be like, oh, it gets me there too. There's like 1,000 ways to get through this. What is this?
Yeah, that's a real sandbox game for sure.
Yeah, it's really it's really cool. And because I had that experience, I am excited that they're taking on this project. I think they're going to do a great job, but I don't like to be a beta tester. I want the final product.
Yeah, I've opted out of that experience. I'm just gonna play the final product. But formative video games for me that inform a lot of my Dungeons and Dragons stories and ideas and with themes. The Fire Emblem games are really excellent, especially the early ones. The more recent ones have gotten a little weird for my taste, but Fire Emblem Sacred Stone, Fire Emblem The Binding Blade, and Fire Emblem Path of Radiance are all really excellent with really solid story and really, really good character development as well. So if you're a DM out there and you're looking for some quick inspiration, pick up a Game Boy Advanced emulator and download the Fire Emblem Sacred Stones ROM. You can do it in like 10 minutes and you're off to the races.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I was also curious. So you did some of the design, like you designed Weavebreaker, right? It
the
says
whole
you're
thing,
the layout.
yeah.
You're the layout artist. So your creativity expands beyond writing or world building into this visual realm. Tell us, is the visual important? Is that an important skill to have? How is that a feature in what you do?
I wish I didn't have to do it. That's one way. It is something that, yeah. So you're right. For the Weavebreaker, I scoured the internet for licensable art and bought the licensing for that professional
and great
art.
artwork, by the way. It looks so good.
Took a really long time to find it because it's buried. It's not exactly easy to find. And then I opened that up in Photoshop and I did all the blending as well, so it looks like it's painted onto the page. And yeah, I just knew that I cared very deeply about the mechanics that I had developed, and I cared very deeply about people using them. And I'm sure you guys feel this very intimately with, it doesn't matter how amazing your book is, if the cover is Garbo, no one's going to read it in a million years. Very similar with D&D products. People look at the art first, and then they read the mechanics second. So I knew no matter how good the content was, if it didn't have good art and good presentation, that people wouldn't use it. And I don't care about people buying it. I care about people using it. If you Google the Weavebreaker, yes, it is purchasable on the Dungeon Masters Guild, but it's also on Reddit. So,
it's also on Reddit.
Yeah, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. That's cool.
Yeah, and I'd just love feedback. If anyone out there is like, oh, I don't know, I'll read this. So I'll pitch the Weavebreaker real quick. So, in Dungeons and Dragons, there are full caster classes, and there are also melee classes. So you have like wizards, and then you have fighters, and then there are a few ways in Dungeons and Dragons to try and accomplish the fantasy of a Gish, which is a magic casting melee fighter, that like mix of the two. If you think kind of Aragon, he's very much a Gish. He's in there sword fighting, but he's also using Brizinger and other spells. And Dungeons and Dragons has really cool combat spells, like Mirror Image, where you can create these mirror duplicates of yourself that make it harder for you to hit, or the Blink or Blur spell, which makes your like form like phase in and out of existence. But because of the way that the mechanics work for the game, if you want to cast one of those spells, it means you can't attack on the same turn. And what that means is that no one uses those spells because.
But also there's the fact that like I like my wizard, I use Mirror Image and Blur and that stuff all the time. But I also stay as far away from the combat as I can.
Right.
Like so they're like a backup. First, just don't get near anyone who will hit you. Second, have some protection up so you don't die if they hit you.
I'm actually surprised that you waste turns, right? Air quotes, turns casting those protection spells, because those are turns that you could be fireballing and thunderbolting and magic missiling.
Well, I'm a 3.5 guy, so I usually am packing around, I've got it's the sequencer, right? So like combat starts, boom, I fire off my first 3 defensive spells. I'm ready to go.
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
So, yeah,
that makes sense.
I know 5e is a little different, and with 5e you can't have a lot of spells going on. Like in 3.5, haste is essential. In 5e, haste is a maybe.
Haste is a maybe in 5th edition. That's exactly correct. So what I wanted to do was create a class that was balanced, that would let you cast Mirror Image and do a multi-attack, an extra attack in the same turn, because that was an essential part of the fantasy. And I think I achieved a balance that offers that. The way that I scaled that class back was I was very specific in the spell selection that is allowed to the class, as compared to other casting classes. And you have very limited spell slots with which to use these resources. So you really have to be an experienced player to use this class effectively. And I also made 3 subclasses for it. So there's one that focuses on kind of like blasting. There's another that focuses on kind of teleportation via time travel. And there's another one that is a mage slayer subclass. So if you want to be like the ultimate mage hunter, you want to be the mage slayer Weavebreaker.
Dang,
sorry, I just
cool.
just jumped on a soapbox. I will relinquish it now.
No, that's awesome. So I loved some of the concepts that I read in there, and was honestly a little surprised. Again, I'm new to D&D, but so your time splicer was temporalized into the future. I think that's the wording you used, which I just thought was awesome. How important, like, is that an original idea or did it come from somewhere? How important is originality when you're doing D&D?
That's a loaded question. So you actually want to be as unoriginal as possible when you're designing mechanics, because when people are critiquing your work, what they will do is they will compare it to official content that has been published. And if your effect is just a little bit better or a little bit worse, that's the thing that they're going to latch onto. And they'll discard your product, because if it's better than what's published, it's overpowered, it's not balanced. And if it's weaker, it's not exciting. So you want to be as you want to innovate as little as possible on the underlying mechanics. So the things that are happening in the game,
physics,
yeah. But you want to innovate as much as possible on the flavor and the fantasy. So what you're selling to people, and I don't mean monetarily, I mean like getting them to invest their time playing the class that you made as opposed to the classes that other people made. You need to sell them on the fantasy that they will be able to experience at the table because they picked that class as opposed to a wizard. There are some really cool classes out there. So it's a huge opportunity cost to take a risk on someone's homebrew class that they're presenting to you.
Cool. So, and I think this applies to our author crowd who don't play D&D. I noticed that there's consequences. So you say, well, if you use more of this like time elements up front, you have to wait that many more turns later. So there's severe consequences for doing something cool. It costs you.
Yep.
How important is that to the story, and how does that fit in?
So that definitely is more of kind of a game part of Dungeons and Dragons. So all classes have resources that they can spend that they don't get back until they take a long rest, which is the equivalent of kind of like camping out for the night or staying in an inn. So presenting, so that isn't all too different from the other things that are out there. That class in particular, though, you have identified has a little bit more of a risk reward as opposed to spending the resources that you just have at your disposal. There's no downside to spending a resource. In this class, I wanted the idea of time travel to feel risky, especially in combat. And honestly, the whole theme of the Weave Breaker is this idea of risk, that you're messing with magic in ways that magic should not be messed with. Whereas the wizard is doing precise calculations, you are cutting through the weave in very precise ways and like activating magic in that way, almost kind of like a blade dancer or a magical blade dancer. So all of the different subclasses have this element of risk. Like all of the classes to cast spells, you have to spend hit dice, which is not something that is present in other Dungeons and Dragons classes.
Yeah, I was like, whew, that's like a blood mage.
Yeah, that's the vibe. Is kind of like you're putting your body through incredible stress to be able to exact these like really powerful and dynamic effects on the battlefield. And for a player who's not experienced, and for a dungeon master who's not experienced, that's not going to go so well. So if you have a player who just wants to use all their abilities, they might spend all of their hit dice, and they might be running very low on hit dice, which means that they won't have as much health as everybody else, and they might be at risk of dying. And in Dungeons and Dragons, if your character dies, that's it. Yeah, you have to sacrifice that character. They're dead. You have to make a brand new character, brand new story. Whatever you thought was going to be the character arc for that character, you have to put it away. It's gone. It's not going to happen. That's the way the story unfolded, and that's kind of the fun of the game as well, as characters die. But for a dungeon master, you also need to punish that behavior appropriately as well. So a lot of dungeon masters won't use short rests in their games. They'll just be running Dungeons and Dragons, and they'll kind of just let their players recharge their abilities whenever they want. If you have a weave breaker in your party, you gotta kind of hit the brakes a little bit on that, because they will probably overextend themselves, and you want them to feel the pain of having overextended themselves.
Cool. So I kind of want to get to the wind down. I have some rapid fire questions, but first I want to ask you to pitch your podcast to our novelist listeners.
So running Dungeons and Dragons is very similar, I think, to kind of trying to grab readers with your story. And with our podcast, what we do is we look at the specific elements that will be present in your games of Dungeons and Dragons, and we kind of break apart what makes those things work at your table, especially if they're not working, and then the mechanics that couple with that to make it work. So I think a really good example of this is our first episode, which we unpack sandboxing versus railroading, where if you're a dungeon master and you're a new dungeon master and you're railroading your players, because that's typically where people start, because modules are usually planned adventures, and you're trying to embrace this idea of sandboxing, which is creating a world for your players or your readers to interact with. We kind of talk about the pros and cons to both, because there absolutely are pros to running a more railroad centric adventure, and the specific things that you can do in your game to change up your style the next time you play Dungeons and Dragons. Perhaps another example that's a little bit easier to equate to writing is we have an episode about rivals. So how do you put a compelling rival in front of your players that they want to engage with, that they're interested in? Yeah, so your players get to decide wherever they want to go. So if you put a rival in front of your players and that story wraps up, in your head, you want that character to be recurring. But if you did a bad job pitching that character to your player who's supposed to be their rival and they walk in the other direction, what an amazing learning opportunity that is, right? Like, wow, I really wrote that rival in a very non-compelling way, so much so that it was for that specific player. This was going to be like a thing that interacted with their backstory. They wrote their backstory, so presumably they're very interested in their backstory, and they don't want to interact with this character at all. What a valuable lesson to learn, especially like to learn that lesson after having written that rival in a book. We're talking about like a feedback loop of maybe years, months minimum, where like you find out that a reader doesn't care about the rival. With a player, you put the rival in front of them, they don't care. Well, guess what? Guess who's showing up 2 sessions from now when we're playing Dungeons and Dragons? It's that rival who now you've gotten to kind of tinker with and try to find ways to make them appealing to your player to interact with. So
that small feedback loop is just the coolest.
Yeah, immediate. Yeah, really, really cool. And then with Dungeons and Dragons, so then for bringing the mechanics in, Dungeons and Dragons is a game about killing things. A lot of the rules in the game are whether or not you hit a thing and whether or not and how much damage you do to it. So it can be really hard to keep rivals alive in your story of Dungeons and Dragons, because if your player says, oh, I'm going to kill this person, they're my rival, I'm going to beat them and I'm going to kill them, in your head you want this to be a recurring character, and you can't just say no, you're not allowed to kill this character, because then you're breaking the social contract of the game, the collaboration of the game. But as a dungeon master, you can give your rivals in-game mechanical tools that will help them to survive. So something that we talk about in that episode is giving them a magic item that gives them access to the Dimension Door spell, which is a long-range teleportation spell. So rather than telling your player, no, you're not allowed to kill this character, you just have them use that spell. And then if we have more sophisticated advice as well, where you can put that rival inside the same adventuring guild that your players are a part of. So there are consequences to killing that character, very much like John Wick, where if they decide to kill that character, they can't do it just on a whim, because now the adventuring guild will not only ostracize them, but maybe hunt them down. And then this creates this really cool dynamic in your game of Dungeons and Dragons, where as the rival becomes more powerful alongside your players, presumably you're rising up in seniority within this adventuring guild. So the consequences of killing your rival very naturally over time decrease to the point where they become maybe acceptable to your player, who at this point has maybe had like 6 or 7 encounters with the rival, which will make that kill so much more satisfying, or the defeat so much more satisfying. So we do tons of episodes like that. We deep dive about factions. We just talked about magic items, different types of magic items and their story significance versus their power level. So if that sort of stuff is interesting to you, please do come check out our show.
And give us the title of your show and where we can find it.
It's Running Off the Rails, and it's available everywhere podcasts are found. I challenge you to try and find a place where podcasts are found, and it's not there, because I've tried to be very thorough. I know I like to listen to my podcasts on Stitcher. That's a podcast platform not many people use. It's there. It's everywhere. It should be everywhere. And if it's not, let me know. And we're available at Running Off the Rails on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And our Gmail is runningofftherails1974 at gmail.com, because runningofftherails@gmail.com
was taken.
and we also have a website, runningofftherails.com, where you can find our show, the products that I've created. We also have some blog posts, etc. Yeah.
Well, and let me just say to you listeners, these are all linked in the show notes, so you can just tap them down there.
Awesome.
Man, so I just wanted to say a writing parallel that came up as you were talking. It's sometimes I think we as authors have a particular outcome in mind, and we make the character lead to that outcome, and a reader identifies that as inauthentic. And I just think it's so cool that as a DM, you can have your intentions in mind, but your characters literally get to choose for themselves because they're run by other people. And I just think that's a good lesson for an author to just remember, like, it's not up to me. It's up to being authentic to this character. And have I built a person that would do that? And I just feel like that's really essential in a plot.
Absolutely. Your players will surprise you all the time. Like, my players they're not even like, some players pride themselves on being unpredictable. That's kind of like their thing. My players are not like that. They try to play their characters authentically as best they can, and they surprise me all the time. So that just resonates so much with me, that my take on their character, who I've spent days with at this point playing Dungeons and Dragons with their character, I feel like I know them pretty well. They make decisions all the time that if I were trying to role play for them, I wouldn't have made that decision. So it's a really great learning experience.
Yeah, that is so cool. Okay, just a couple quick rapid fires. Tell us a favorite book or the book you're reading right now.
I just finished Exile, from the Star Child series. I truly mean it when I say it was really excellent, and it has inspired some things that I want to do and bring to my Dungeons and Dragons game. So thank you for that.
That's super cool.
Other than that, though, I'm reading Effective Java, because I just joined a programming team at my company that uses Java heavily. Wouldn't recommend it unless you're really interested in learning Java. In that case, it's truly excellent.
A lot of us have to balance a day job with our creative passion. Are there any insights or lessons that you've learned along those lines?
Absolutely. Do the thing that you care about being successful first in the morning. So if that's the product that you're working on, or the book or the adventure that you're planning for your friends, do that first thing in the morning. If you're in a phase of your life where your job needs more attention, do that first thing in the morning, because I think, so I was watching the Brandon Sanderson lectures, and there's one part in the lecture where he says, you know what a great job is if you want to be a writer? He says, a great job if you want to be a writer is bricklaying, because it doesn't require any thought, and you can spend your entire day while you're laying brick writing in your head. And then you have an hour when you go home just to get those thoughts down. And then he continues. I'm like, wow, that's really smart. That's a really good insight. He continues then, and he goes, you know what the worst job in the world is to be if you want to be a successful creative? He goes, a computer programmer. It's like, no. But it's so true, because programming requires a lot of creative energy. And I have absolutely noticed that my creative projects die, like no progress at all on them when work is particularly challenging. And then when work becomes pretty routine, all of a sudden I start producing way more creative content. It's a science. It's not a coincidence.
That's cool. Let's imagine that there's a listener like me who hasn't ever played D&D, but they listened to this episode and they said, you know what? That's me. I love the world building, and I don't think I want to be a novelist now that I get it. And now that I see that there's this other way to get this creativity out, to express it, what do I do? Like how I'm going to need friends. I'm going to need a DM. I'm going to need to become like, where do I start?
It can be a little bit overwhelming. First of all, my advice would be just go for it. The first time, no matter what, it's not going to be as easy as your second time, and the second time won't be as easy as your third time. As is true with everything in life. If you are lucky and you have some friends who have been hearing about Dungeons and Dragons, I swear everybody has a friend now who plays and is like, you gotta try it. So it's not nearly as hard as it was 10 years ago to find people to play with, as it is today. Find 2 people, 3 people, it doesn't need to be a whole table of people who are willing to try it with you. And just like get beers or if you drink like non-alcoholic seltzers, get some of those and some snacks, and just spend a night hanging out with your friends and just figuring it out. And don't worry so much about the rules. A lot of people get like tunnel vision on like, well, we got to play it right. The rules help make a great story. So if you feel like the rules are getting in the way of the story, just keep pulling out, getting rid of rules, not worrying about rules until you feel like the story is good. And then over time, you're like, oh, this story would improve a lot if maybe the stakes were a little bit higher. Well, you know what introduces stakes to a game? More complicated rules. So you can bring in a few more rules. So first of all, listen to our podcast. But the person who really formed my paradigms about how to run Dungeons and Dragons was an individual called Matthew Colville. He's on YouTube, and he has an amazing playlist called Running the Game. And the first 1, 2, 3 episodes of that playlist are truly amazing for being like, this is the bare minimum stuff that you need to run Dungeons and Dragons for your friends. For free, right? Like without monetary investment. I had a coworker who I just ran Dungeons and Dragons for the first time last week. And he said, I've been wanting to run Dungeons and Dragons for my children for forever. And I haven't been able to figure out how to do it because it's so hard. I gave him that series and he ran it for his kids over the weekend. Because
that's awesome.
Just watching those first 2 episodes was enough where he's like, yeah, I could do this. And then he just did it. And he said it went great. And in true kid fashion, I think he like had one of the enemies was like a wolf attack. And his daughter was like, this wolf is now my pet wolf. And that's not a part of the rules. So he just needed to roll with it. So
that's so cool.
That's a great example of like, say yes. The rules of improv absolutely apply in a lot of ways to Dungeons and Dragons. a long-winded answer to a short question.
No, that is excellent. Ray, thank you so much for joining our podcast. It's an honor. To our listeners, please look in the show notes for links to more of his works. And to you listeners, it's time to start writing. Hi, this is Jay, and I wanted to add a brief postscript. Before the episode began, we chatted with Ray for about 45 minutes, and it's like the extended edition of Lord of the Rings, and there's some cool stuff in that more casual conversation that I think you will enjoy. A particular segment that matters to me is Ray recently read Star Child Exile and gave me some glowing feedback, which was awesome, and some critical feedback, which was really cool for me to hear. I felt like he was very insightful. And I think to all of you writers and authors who have similar projects, I think his feedback could be insightful for you. And again, this is kind of the behind the scenes stuff. We're not sharing it with everybody. We are sharing it in particular with our Patreon supporters. So if you're one of those, then look at your Patreon to access this behind the scenes content. And if you're not, click the link in the description so that you can become one of our supporters. Again, I also just want to thank you so much for listening. Your attention is worth a lot, and we appreciate that you're spending the time to listen to us. It's obviously something we love, and we're glad that you love it too. So thank you.